that's not the American way. This country was not founded on those principles. But in terms of jihad, I don't know of peace-loving Muslims worldwide that support really the destruction of the West and its religions, and certainly the United States.
The other thing that I'd like to get your comments on, we'll have to put it off until a little later in the program, but what is it about American policy in the Middle East that has engendered such hatred on the part of these people? What has this country done over there to build these emotions, and what sorts of policy initiatives might be possible, starting yesterday preferably, to try to ameliorate some of this intense hatred, for want of a better way to say it? But that's for a little later in the broadcast. Jason in New Hampshire is with us, and Gary Tuchman is covering Ground Zero tonight, the site of the collapse of the World Trade Center. And Gary, Jason has a question for you. So we'll see if we can do a three-way hookup here. This is a new program. We'll try this technology out here. Jason, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Gary, are you there?
I am here, Jack.
All right, this may work. Go ahead, Jason.
I have a quick question. I really don't want to seem macabre with this, but I remember hearing on the news a couple days ago that the pile from the World Trade Center is approximately 100 feet high. And they're saying that maybe a lot of the material, the big cloud, was actually steel and concrete and gypsum and whatnot vaporizing. What's to say that didn't happen to, A, a lot of the people in the building, and two, I mean, the human body is fragile. What's to say that we haven't, the victims or the missing haven't been, well, for lack of a better way to put it, pressed into their component pieces by all the falling rubble?
Well, the sad fact, Jason, is that much of what has been found are remains. That's very sad, but it's very true. There are actually workers on the scene just behind me a few blocks carrying buckets to collect that. However, what they are hoping is that survivors are in pockets, which they're referring to as voids. The 6 people who have been recovered, survivors, were found in these pockets and weren't touched by any of the rubble. They were just well below it. And that's the hope. Certainly, if they're within the rubble, that would be very hard to survive. But there's great hope that people are below all the rubble and haven't been touched by it.
All right. Jason, thank you. Gary, thank you. Let's go back for a moment to Mary Schiavo, who is a severe critic of the airline system in this country, and she brings her opinions based on a strenuous background as a Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Transportation. We were talking earlier, and I told you I wanted to ask you about this transponder that all commercial airlines carry. It's my understanding that the transponder, these guys who hijacked these planes knew what they were doing. They turned off the transponders. And the transponders, as I understand them, are the only way that air traffic controllers can identify which flights these are. So when they strayed off their flight path, which they did rather dramatically, the transponders have been turned off, and they're reduced to simply a blip on a radar screen, and the FAA has no way of knowing what that blip is. Am I somewhat in the ballpark with what those things do?
That's right. Well, Americans will remember a couple years ago, even Air Force One was reduced to a blip on the screen. You can do that for various and sundry reasons, but when you turn off the transponder, the air traffic controllers could still tell who was whom because they had been tracking the flight. But you lose things like altitude information, identification information, so they could see the blip on the screen, but they didn't have too much else to go on except the one transmission to one of the towers when one of the pilots was able to leave his comm line open.
Would it make any sense to fix these things so they couldn't be disabled? I mean, would that be of any help or not?
Well, actually, we have many things that we could do. One of the recommendations after Egypt Air, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, but after the Egypt Air tragedy on October 31, 1999, one of the recommendations by the NTSB was to actually install cockpit video, and that is not just static video that you recover like a black box. It's also possible to have video that is transmitted, and that recommendation will undoubtedly become a prominent one again, because then we would have had an idea, and there's a question whether between the first plane and the last one, the one in Pennsylvania, maybe even the Pentagon, we would have had enough information to know more fully what was going on.
Is this what they call real-time video?
Yes.
Is that what they prefer? Where they put a little camera in the cockpit, that just like you put a camera in the nursery to watch the baby, right?
Yes, and it's curious that the pilots had objected to that before, and over the last 4 days I have gotten many, many calls from pilots talking about things like wanting to arm themselves, etc. And now I think everyone realizes that video would actually protect the pilots and the passengers some. So that would be another thing besides a transponder. And one other thing I'm hoping that we can get good data off the cockpit voice recorder or off of at least one of these flights, because in another suicide attack on a plane, the Silk Air plane crash has been ruled a suicide. And in that case, the suicide pilot was so savvy that he pulled the fuses on the cockpit voice recorder. Now, that would give us a real indication, if that was done here, how well they had studied other tragedies and how well they were acquainted with the planes. It would really give a tremendous amount of insight. One other thing I wanted to add, and you'd mentioned about general aviation and the small planes all over the country, and the fact we have 655,000 pilots in America. It's pretty hard to track them all. Only those airports with commercial service have to have a security plan in place, a secure perimeter. Only those airports that are so designated at certain levels have to have that. There are lots of little airfields literally all over the country that have little small planes sitting on them. And it was those planes, curiously, when I was in the government, it was those small planes, you know, the Moonies, the Cessnas, the Bonanzas, sitting all over the country that the FAA perceived as their terrorist threat. They did realize that terrorists could steal planes, but for some reason the FAA thought they would steal small planes. And even though that was their worry, we really don't have a security plan in place for all these small planes all over the country. Now we see they aren't the threat. The threat, terrorists have much bigger things in mind for those planes. And there's one other thing that's very interesting about the terrorists. We actually have a federal statute, 28 U.S.C. 16 something, and that is our list of countries which harbor terrorists. And the State Department puts the countries on that list by publishing it in the Federal Register. Afghanistan is not on that list, and that's something important that the state and that's something that the State Department will have to do, because it is that list which allows people to go after the assets of a country that harbors terrorism. So there's much to be done, even on sort of the end of putting all the ducks in a row.
All right, Mary, we've got a viewer in Illinois, Bruce, who has a question for you. Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Mary. I thought about sky marshals. What would you think of the idea of having 20-year veteran retired police officers? They'd be 45 to 55 years old, obviously with a track record that you could check as sky marshals.
Well, and not just a track record that you can check. You make an extremely important point. You know, and you probably know we did have sky marshals, but over the years the program was gutted. That was one of the security measures that I fought against ending. We used to have a couple thousand. It dwindled to something like 250, and finally it dwindled to about 30. And I and some others objected to that. And people now talk about, well, we're going to put sky marshals back on the plane. What's very important to realize, and since you've been through police training, you know this, it takes a lot of training to know when you have a shoot, no shoot situation, when it's a passenger panicking versus terrorists standing up to start a hijacking, and it is that training that is going to be crucial. I taught not that particular part of the training, but I taught legal things at the FBI Academy, and I had a chance to experience that. And the shoot, no shoot decision making you don't learn overnight. So someone like yourself who has had that kind of training would be someone who would be much more valuable to start up or to expand the program again from our dwindled number. And that's going to be the biggest problem with air marshals, getting them through either FLETC or Glencoe or Quantico, and getting them this training. So air marshals aren't going to be here overnight.
All right, Mary, thanks. And Bruce, thank you for the question. What about, Harvey Kushner, the fact that all of these airplanes were less than half full? I've heard it debated as to whether or not that may have been significant. This was a Tuesday morning. There are a lot of flights that leave from the East Coast. These were all bound for California. But all of them had less than half a passenger load. Is that significant? And if so, what would it possibly mean?
Well, it's my belief, if I had to go back and trace the mindset of these hijackers, they probably knew those routes, probably even knew maybe flew them before, and knew the pattern, you know, which day is most likely to have the least amount. Clearly, if you want to the question was how much fuel, not how many passengers you had aboard.
Right.
You know, it was a clear day, so it looks like it was selected exactly like that. I don't know if it worked out that way.
Somebody suggested that they may have bought all the seats, the hijackers, somebody could have bought all the seats so that there'd be fewer passengers to handle when you tried to physically take over the aircraft.
It could have been, you know, you could have made a lot of calls and say, hold the seats.
Sure.
I noticed that some people have mentioned that these terrorists used Travelocity.com to buy a ticket. They rented cars, and they act as if these are some Stone Age people. They're
right.
people like
They're
you
on
and
the
me, and a lot of, right.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, so we shouldn't be surprised. But I do think it was well orchestrated, and it might have been the luck of the draw, Jack, rather than doing something like that on that particular day.
Mary, you have a couple of thoughts on this?
I do. Actually, there was a strategic reason also for that early morning flight, and that is, as it was the first flight out, you didn't have the worry about a delay on the inbound, and obviously a large percentage of U.S. domestic flights are delayed. So by strategically selecting the first flight out, I know some people thought, well, it was the first flight because they loaded weapons on overnight. No, it was the first flight out because the timing was important. You know, because once people figured out what was going on, we did get fighters up there, scrambled to get up in the air. So the first flight of the day offered a strategic advantage to them as well. So I agree with Harvey. This was clearly extremely well planned out. And there are many other things that will certainly come out in the days ahead. For example, did they make reservations and change them? American Airlines has a very good tracking system. They literally keep book on us. They keep book on us so they can supposedly keep us happy, but they also keep very careful records of how we've changed our reservations, etc. And that will be interesting to see if they had to wait for another day or an opportune time or had changed their reservations at all.
All right, George is in North Carolina. George, I'll be right with you. But Mary, I want to ask you one other thing. I read a story, and I hope it's not true. I read a story that one of the airlines involved in this had gone to Congress to ask for some sort of legal immunity from civil prosecution lawsuits on the part of folks who died on those airplanes almost before we knew what had happened. Is that story true? And if so, where does that stand?
Well, that's on the internet and it's widely reported, and in fact there are some quotes by Senator McCain, and he's usually right on aviation issues, and he actually took the airlines to task. It's reported on the internet that it was American Airlines literally the day after it was lobbying Congress. Now, whether it was American Airlines or not, I mean, we've got a choice of two here, but that they were lobbying to have Congress declare that people injured on the ground, only those on the plane, and no one on the ground could seek any kind of accountability from that airline. That goes against literally everything that's been developed in American law to date. But what's more shocking to me, I mean, it's too early to be making those decisions right now. What's more shocking to me is before the care teams were even in place to take care of the victims, an airline was lobbying Congress to be absolved. Now, that does not bode well, and I predict there'll be a big backlash for that. That was an incredibly poor taste, and it was unbelievably crass and really did not reflect well on the aviation industry.
Yeah, all right. Harvey?
Yeah, Mary, I have a question for you. I believe that a couple of the hijackers had first-class tickets one way, was sitting in seats 1A. Our computerized system of profiling, wouldn't you think, and I believe the first-class ticket one was paid by cash or even by credit card, but shouldn't that have raised some eyebrows in a computer someplace, Mary?
Yes.
It seems to me that to me is a typical exercise in what you should look for.
In what way? I'm not sure I understand.
I think Mary
yes,
understands.
He's absolutely right. He is absolutely right. Buying a one-way ticket, particularly with cash, is supposed to set off alarm bells. But unfortunately, we have a piecemeal system, and so the alarm bells that sets off usually is to reconcile the passenger to the baggage. And buying a one-way ticket, if you buy a one-way ticket with cash, it's supposed to also set you up for closer profiling. Unfortunately, the profiling that we do is very limited. You know, did you pack your own bags, etc. If you checked a bag, did you really get on the plane? Did you present the right credentials? You know, the photo driver's license, and did you use a credit card? So that should have set off alarm bells. One-way ticket cash is always supposed to gin up closer checking.
All right, fair enough. George in North Carolina, if you're real quick, what can we do for you? I'm getting behind here, and it's my first night doing this.
Well, my question is about the economic impact of if we have a long, drawn-out war. I was wondering if we were going to step up production in the textile, plastic, and the steel industry, or are we going to reward these companies that moved off to Mexico and other countries?